Events that have been primarily driven by non-cyber threat considerations. That's primarily what defines them. And they're also all events where organizations that we worked with have asked myself and Shanyn and members of the Mandiant team the question of, what does this event mean for threats to our organization? And the key thing about that is there's not one right answer to that question. The best answer that anyone can provide is really an assessment of what could be the threats that we need to tell our organization about and why, and what are the pieces of information that we need to provide, what are the questions that we need to answer. Because really, this question of what does this event mean for threats to my organization is trying to bridge two worlds. It's trying to say, what do you know about a geopolitical event, and connect that all the way through to security actions, like what hunting actions should my hunting team do across my assets. Before we start to talk about lessons learned and how we've dealt with situations like this, a little bit of background on our speakers and why myself and Shanyn are talking about this. Between us, we've got over 20 years of experience in helping organizations deal with this exact type of challenge. And across a lot of different industries, organizations all over the world, we've had the opportunity to work with. We come from a threat intelligence background, so we've actually worked on kind of the full scope of cyber threats that organizations need to be thinking about in situations like this, depending on the situation, whether it's nation-state intrusions or cyber criminal activity. We've worked hands-on with dealing with those threats and helping organizations respond to them. And finally, something that really drove our interest in this topic right now is we actually just led a refresh of Mandiant's internal function around crisis response intelligence and support to crisis response efforts. Just like any organization, Mandiant is always changing. Over the last couple years, we divested part of our business. We reoriented our business around a new platform. As you may have heard, we've been going through an acquisition. So, change that happens across any organization. We were in need of a refresh of our capability, and myself and Shanyn just spent a lot of time working on that. And as we go along, we're going to be talking about some examples related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, both because that's a very timely case study and because we were actually going through the process of setting up that refreshed Mandiant internal crisis intelligence function at the same time that the Ukraine crisis was unfolding. So we're going to be looking at it from that perspective. So what does success look like?
So one of the things that organizations really struggle with when they're trying to set up their crisis management functions is they tend to think that if we produce the right intelligence, we put the best intelligence in the world together, or we purchase from vendors the best intelligence, the solution is already there, right? It's kind of this field of dreams mentality where it's like, if you build it, they will come. And so anytime we're talking about intelligence, we're really trying to move them away from that mentality. So there's kind of a formula for success that we put together, and it is that you have to deliver intelligence to the right people at the right time, in the right format, with the right content to help them make the right decisions. And this is true not just for crisis, but also anytime you have an intelligence apparatus in general. So we're going to go through each one of these elements and give examples about how we built this out from a process perspective, and then kind of demonstrate, again, in the context of Ukraine, kind of what that looks like.
So the first question that we'll look at is, how do I know what intelligence I need to deliver? How do I know what topics I need to cover for my stakeholders? And we're going to be talking about this from the perspective of what does just good look like versus what does great look like. I've seen a lot of situations where organizations have pretty good metrics or pretty good ways to identify, okay, this is a topic that we really need to cover as we're helping an organization respond to some kind of externally driven crisis or urgent situation. But it's a really tricky thing to do. Back to that issue that I talked about of how do I take what I know about a geopolitical crisis and connect that through to specific security actions. So it's really tough for organizations to get it great. And we're going to be talking about some of the common challenges that we've seen that define what good versus great looks like. The first way that we've seen responses to this question manifest as good when they could be great is organizations kind of defaulting into thinking about the need for what do I cover from the perspective of what threat activity have we seen before, or what threat activity do we know has been impacting organizations like ours in the past. And the thinking is kind of, well, what have we seen before that we could see again? And the problem with that, of course, is threat actors and who they are targeting and how they are doing that evolves. And as an example, there have been some self-purported hacktivist groups that in the Russia-Ukraine crisis this year have received a lot of attention, for example, Killnet. And one of the trends that we saw was those in their rhetoric and in their activities initially started focusing on Eastern Europe, and as time goes on, we've seen that expanding. For example, we've seen Killnet taking interest in healthcare organizations in the United States. And if you were looking at what issues do I need to address from the perspective of what have we seen before, that might be something that you would miss, because there's been that significant change in targeting from what occurred in the past. The second way that we've seen response look good but not great is the thinking defaulting to what new threat activity is happening. Have we seen any changes? What have we seen that's different from before? And the problem with that is it misses a couple ways that the timing of threat activity can be different than public attention around a crisis situation. For example, what if the threat activity was a cause of the situation? What if the actors were preparing for the situation before it became publicly prominent? As an example of the challenges around this area, in one of the significant intrusions that we saw related to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, we saw actors come back and activate a foothold that they'd established in the environment 3 years earlier and conduct some pretty damaging follow-on activity. So definitely something that organization would have wanted to be prepared for, not the type of thing that you would find if you were just focusing on what's new. The last way that we've seen response look good but not great is looking at what threat activity has some kind of explicit link to the situation. And this is really frequently in situations where what organizations look at is primarily driven by online activity and interactions. For example, dark web activity, social media, et cetera. And when they're looking for what's relevant by virtue especially of something like a keyword, is where we often see this challenge arising. And of course, the potential there is that you would miss something that's definitely related to the situation, but is missing whatever is that explicit link. As an example, in the early days of the invasion of Ukraine, we, through our regular research activity, identified an intrusion attempt targeting a journalist. And as we looked into it, we identified that while this wasn't clear up front, it was conducted by a Russian state actor, or what we suspected to be a Russian state actor, and it was targeting a British journalist who was based in Ukraine at the time. So if you were looking for, what threat activity do I need to understand to make sure that I'm protected, definitely something that you would want to know about, but wouldn't necessarily have an explicit link like a keyword to the situation. So what does great look like? There's a lot of ways that this can be tailored to an individual organization's needs, but the important thing is that we start from the perspective of if we were to experience threat activity associated with this event, what could it be? And you could break that down into questions like, what objectives would actors be looking to accomplish and why? What threat actors have we seen conducting operations in line with those objectives? What patterns have we seen emerging in similar situations in the past? Again, the specifics can kind of be adapted to the individual organization's needs, but the important thing is starting from that holistic perspective of if we were to experience threat activity associated with this event, what could it look like? So we'll move on next to next component of the formula for success.
Yeah, so when we're talking about, we figured out what intelligence content we want to be communicating, the next thing we really need to think about is who we should be communicating it to, right? So when we think about who our stakeholders are, it's almost a place we want to always start, maybe even before we start thinking about the intelligence that we want to deliver, because the end goal of intelligence is always create some sort of action, right? Intelligence has to lead to action. And the stakeholders, think about the audiences, the recipients of that intelligence, they are the one who are responsible for turning that intelligence into action. So when we're talking about who our stakeholders are, a lot of organizations haven't gone through the exercise of doing a stakeholder analysis. It should be a dedicated work stream, again, not just for the context of crisis, but in general, anytime you are trying to build intel into your functions, you need to know who your stakeholders are. You need to know what their use cases are. You need to know what is the full range of possible actions that they can take, and then think about how you can use intelligence to help them get there. And that's extremely, extremely important in the context of crisis, because that loop between when they receive the intelligence and when they action it has to be very tight and efficient. So you have to make sure that you're giving them the essentials that they can actually use and operationalize. And so for organizations that don't have that stakeholder analysis built out yet, we kind of condensed it down to what I call stakeholder analysis on the fly. And it's basically 7 essential questions. It's who needs to know this information, what exactly is it that they need to know, why do they need to know it, right? What are their intelligence requirements? How might they respond with the analysis? In other words, what are they going to do with it? When do they need a response? How urgent is this? Is this something that can be built into an existing cadence, or is this a pick up the phone in the middle of the night kind of thing? You're not going to know that, and you're going to have a lot of uncertainty if you haven't already done this sort of analysis with your stakeholders before a crisis breaks out. Other things like where should we send their response, and really specifically, what should we avoid including? And again, this is an exercise that you want to go through before you're trying to grapple with a crisis that has a lot of pressure and sort of time requirements. When we're talking about who our stakeholders are, I think a lot of time organizations think that it's the SOC, it's the folks who are doing security, it's the folks who are maybe even on, if you've got different intelligence analysis teams, they think InfoSec. But in reality, your stakeholders are everybody in the organization. Everybody can get value out of intelligence in some way because the goal is to reduce uncertainty. The goal is to give them the right information and right analysis to help remove their uncertainty, again, so they can take the key actions and proactively secure your network or whatever your final mission is. So this is just an example org chart that shows the full range of stakeholders you should be thinking about when you do your stakeholder analysis, because it's a lot more than folks usually think it is. So when we think about, if you don't mind, keep going. When we think about how we did this when we were building out this crisis function and sort of in the context of Ukraine, we went through and we did the stakeholder analysis for basically all of Mandiant, trying to understand who the different stakeholders are, what their different use cases are, what decisions they're trying to make, where their uncertainty lies. Mandiant's a very large company. So, and I feel like a lot of organizations, specifically government organizations, might be dealing with significant numbers of stakeholders. So it's not really plausible for you to communicate one-to-one with all these different teams. And it wasn't plausible for us either. So what we did was we took all of these different audiences, once we'd done our stakeholder analysis, and we started sticking them in buckets based on commonalities and things of use cases, based on what type of infrastructure they like to deal with, what their general workflow looks like, at what points do they usually try to inject intelligence, or where are the missed opportunities where they could be injecting intelligence? What are their different expectations of the intelligence team that were already established? And did we need to break those expectations or build on them, or just meet the expectations that already existed? So when we kind of, again, took all these different audiences and put them into communications buckets, so we wouldn't be communicating with individual teams, we would be, again, communicating with these groups. We kind of plotted it out as concentric circles. And these concentric circles of information mean that each one of these audiences, these groups that you see here in these concentric circles, we're communicating to them in a different way, but with different information and different intelligence, because that's what they needed, right? So that innermost circle, that's our steering committee. So our crisis function is run by a steering committee. That's a really great way to ensure that you have buy-in and sort of, if you think about it from a RACI perspective, accountability from your senior leadership, because they're the ones who are going to be able to designate resources that execute on your crisis function, right? So the steering committee was extremely important to make sure we had that organization-wide buy-in, and then we're able to resource effectively. And in that innermost concentric circle, this is where we include all of our TLP red, all of our sensitive information. And then moving out from there, we move down to work stream leads. So those are the folks who report up to the steering committee, but are actually hands on the keys executing. And they need very different information than the steering committee does, because they're trying to make very different decisions. They're dealing with different uncertainties. And so the actions they can take are different. And so again, we have to work backwards from that full range of actions and make sure we're giving them the information that will help them decide which one to take, and then take it. Moving out to that, we have another concentric circle. That's folks who are relevant to analysis. So all of our intel teams, all of our collection functions, everybody who needs to be pushing information into a centralized location and then turning that into full analysis, so then they can create intel products and push it out to other stakeholders. And again, they need different information than our work stream leads and our steering committee would, right? It kept going company-wide. Sometimes we need to send out company-wide emails that's going to have very general information that we would feel comfortable going to the public with, right? So that's when we have folks who are in marketing, folks who are in sales, really anybody who needs to have situational awareness and things like talking points, right? Working backwards, again, what is it that these folks need to do, and how can we make sure we're only giving them the essentials to help them do it? And then from there, there's the public, right? What is the stuff we want to have to go in webinars? What's the information we want to have in blogs? How do we make sure that that information, we don't run into an issue where somebody is inadvertently sharing out sensitive information to the general public because it was mixed in with non-sensitive information and they just didn't know, right? Again, making sure that when we bucket these things in these concentric circles, we're making sure we're getting them the right intel without kind of breaking the trust or making folks maybe a little overcautious because they're worried they're going to share something they're not supposed to and get in trouble. And there's asterisks by the public because that's where we really, really brought in the rapid response on the marketing side and the comms function. So because our crisis function is really focused only on internal stakeholders, because again, they're the ones who need to take the actions to communicate to the public. So once we've kind of figured out the intelligence and we figured out who the different stakeholders are, we need to figure out when we are communicating with them. And again, these are decisions you want to make before the crisis has hit. So there's kind of a balance when we're trying to think about what is our communications cadence. On the one hand, we could just be rapid fire, sending out all the intelligence, all the information that we possibly can, and because our goal is to reduce that uncertainty, right? But then we have to balance that out with the fact that our audience at some point is going to get really tired of hearing from us because we're interrupting all of their workflows and we're making it difficult for them to take that action that we actually want them to take, right? So we had to be very careful that we were balancing these things and not causing too much audience fatigue, but also getting them information at the right time when it was early enough that they could actually action it. And so this is kind of the workflow that we built out. So I'll kind of break this down. That top row where you see things like media comms, SIG, cyber espionage, cybercrime, those are all of the different internal teams who are our stakeholders. In this particular sort of instance, they also serve as our collect function because they are the ones who are actively pushing information into this centralized location for us to then translate, in a sense, and communicate and provide that sort of high-level analysis and then push it out to other stakeholders who can action it, right? So they push it through us, and then we, on the left-hand column, you see the significant event. Those are all of the different vehicles that we have set up for communicating. And some of them are ad hoc, some of them are responsive, but some of them are standard briefings or standard email series that have been going weekly for years. And so the audience knows already that it's already on their calendars, they're not going out of their way. So we've built it into their existing workflows, and they expect that information to come from there, right? So if there's something that doesn't have to be pushed out immediately, if it doesn't require immediate action, we save it for those different briefing series. And those different briefing series are broken down, again, based on stakeholder requirements. So again, stakeholders need different information, and they need it discussed at different levels. So we have 3 different series. We have a strategic, we have an operational, we have a tactical briefing series. And they all look at the same different topics, or the same topic every week, but we look at it through different lenses. So a very tactical briefing will have those indicators. It'll open up malware. It'll say, how did we do the analysis? And then on the other hand, when we talk about strategic, what we're looking at is like, what are the risks? What are the threats to the business? How can we, where do we need to coordinate a more holistic response? Where do we need to be putting resources to get ahead of this threat before it hits us, right? So again, that's a standard vehicle that already exists, and it has audience expectations that it's going to happen at a certain time. It's already on their calendar. They don't need to move things to attend. So it's a very, very sort of stable way for us to communicate. Beyond that, we set up additional ad hoc vehicles. We'll do stand-up calls with the steering committee, right? Basically round robins, 15 minutes, daily updates. What are you seeing? What do you need? What are you doing? Where are the gaps? Right? It's a really efficient way for us to then proactively get ahead and address whatever those gaps are and make sure everybody has perfect information. We'll do situational email updates for different audiences. Some of them are company-wide, some of them are team-specific. But again, those are really ad hoc, and they only surge up in the context of significant events. Cross-functional coordination, we will do sort of very tactical syncs with different analysts and say, hey, what's coming up next? What are you expecting to see? So it's not an update on actions that are being taken or that are planned. It's more of an opportunity for us to look ahead, look at the future, and say, what do we think might be coming that we need to make sure the analysis team is built into their requirements, or that we can make sure that our managed defense team is already proactively looking for or is getting resources aligned to start looking for that, right? So again, all of these different communications vehicles are designed to balance that, do we need to communicate this now, or can it wait until a standard comms cadence, so we're not hitting that audience fatigue level. And then on the right side of the screen, you see rapid response. That's our marketing function. That's when anything that needs to go out into the public eye, we've got them teed up right away. And one key thing that we found was really successful is that the minute something is going to get spun up as a crisis, we call them. We have no idea if we're going to put out anything public. We have no idea if we're going to, there's going to be blogs or statements or webinars, but they have to do resource allocation just like any other team. And so we make sure that all of the teams are teed up from the very beginning so they know what's coming. Even when there's a lot of uncertainty about the nature of what's coming, they know that they need to create bandwidth, they need to create space, they need to get ready. And I think that early alerting is another missing piece that a lot of organizations miss. And it's absolutely crucial to make sure that the folks who are, again, responsible for turning that intelligence into action have the bandwidth to do it. And so this is an example of how we kind of set up the back-end ecosystem or data pool of those sort of differentiated communications vehicles. So the team that is responsible internally, we're 3 people. We're a smaller organization, but it's not really feasible, again, for us to create all of these different products for all of these different audiences if we don't have this sort of self-feeding ecosystem of information on the back end. And that's what's really illustrated here. So on the left, you see an example of one of the emails that we put out to our internal audiences. This one's company-wide. And kind of the content, it provides that situational update, very easy to understand, just keeps folks up to speed on what's happening in the situation. But how do we get there? That's what you see here on the right. So the very first thing that you see is this daily stand-up, that 15-minute round-robin call. The other thing that my team does is we set up the communications infrastructure. So one of the major issues that we deal with, and I think every company deals with, is information silos. Something happens, the first thing that happens is these 6 different teams spin up 6 different chats, and everybody's coordinating in their own little bubble. That is horrible for crisis response. So the first thing we did was try to get rid of that. We set up centralized communications infrastructure and make sure that everybody inside those concentric circles is in the right channel where the right level of information is being shared. Again, marketing is not going to go in the TLP red channel. They're going to go in the public information channel because they don't need to have that sensitive information. It might get accidentally shared, right? So we set up that centralized communications infrastructure. All those different teams are constantly pushing information to it. They're getting live updates. They're immediately pulling from it and using it to run their work streams. But the nice thing about that is my team is not actively out there having to do all the collect ourselves. The teams who are actually on the front lines are serving as the collections function for us. So we're able to take the information very quickly and very efficiently from that communications infrastructure and from that daily stand-up, and then pull it out and tease out and parse it out and use different lenses and speak at different levels to push it out into all of these different vehicles. So the content will go into that daily sit-rep email that gets sent out company-wide. A version of that email will then be adapted into a slide that we give to customers because we know they need to brief their senior leadership on these things as well. It doesn't make sense for 600 different customers to be creating 600 different slides. Let's just give them one, right? Let's do kind of a hub and spoke model where you have the central analytic line that's being created and very official, and it's pushed out to the folks who need to use that and sort of share it with their audiences. The other thing that we do when we create these daily slides and all the rest of these vehicles is we add in the so what. What's the implication? Why does this matter? What can you do with this information? Why are we bothering telling you about it? A lot of times, and this is very crucial for us, but a lot of times intelligence organizations and companies in general struggle because they think that it's self-evident why we're telling you this, right? But it's really not. From the perspective of your audience, they might say, hey, that's really interesting analysis. I don't really know what to do with this, right? So even though you've done that stakeholder analysis, even though you understand the use case, as the analysts, you are the experts. You can't rely on your stakeholders always to figure out what to do with the information or why it's important. You have to explicitly tell them, kind of bridge that gap for them so they don't have to waste cycles on doing the interpretation themselves. They get to jump straight into action. But that only works if you've already gone through the exercise of the stakeholder analysis. Otherwise, you don't know why it matters to them. You can only guess, and that's not a place that you want to be. The other thing that we do from that content, we push it all into a common operating picture. So all of those updates, everything gets put into one place where folks in the company can go and pull data. They don't have to send us a million different requests. When they need something, self-serve. It's there, it's all in one spot, pull it down. And that common operating picture serves as the official organization lens on a subject. So there's no question, is there personal bias? Is this my own interpretation? Are we gonna have 6 different analysts who are saying 6 different things? It doesn't happen, it's all in one spot, and it's all been reviewed by the analysis team. The media, folks like sales, folks like comms can all then go to that common operating picture and amplify that message externally, right? Other places, that common operating picture feeds that weekly bluff series that we do. And then that bluff series, it's PowerPoints that get discussed. So that gets recorded, and those PowerPoints then get distributed to customer-facing folks who then can give those briefings to their customers as needed. They can localize it, they can adapt, and then they can brief. But again, we don't have 60 different analysts or customer-facing folks creating 60 different PowerPoint presentations. So the loop here, what we've done is we've taken weeks' worth of work and condensed it down to something that can be done in a day or two, and is constantly going out with updates that are ad hoc and immediate, but then also for folks who don't want to sit there and monitor that collections infrastructure all day, they can just come to the weekly briefing or they can read the email. Folks like to consume information in different ways, and we need to address that. The other thing is that folks don't retain information after reading an email one time. They say that it takes about 7 touches or 7 ways of 7 times communicating with someone for them to really retain the information. So this is a way for us to kind of short circuit that, because we're giving them information in different ways. They can pay attention if they need to, or they can rely on the vehicles that they're more comfortable with and they have time for. So when we're talking about format, right? The form is the message is the form. We want to make sure that we understand not just the stakeholders' use case, but also how they like to consume information. I think a lot of places where organizations struggle is they say, hey, we need to have a crisis function. Let me go ahead and set up a new app for that. Let me make an app for that. And all that, it might be a perfect app, it might do everything that you need it to, but if your stakeholders have to step out of their workflow, go to that app only for that one thing, and then go back to their workflow, they're probably not gonna do it. They're probably not going to spend the time learning this new system, downloading this new system, configuring it. All you're doing is creating a barrier of entry for that information, and you don't wanna make it hard for folks to consume the information you're trying to give them. You wanna make sure you understand what their workflows are, how they're currently communicating, and as much as you can, embed yourself into those workflows. And so part of that stakeholder analysis is, where do you communicate? What systems do you use? How often do you refer to them? Do you just live in your email inbox? Are you more Teams chats? Or whatever, Slack, whatever it might be? How do you make sure that you are integrating into the things they're already looking at to hit those 7 touches? And any time that we are doing any sort of product, even though we're differentiating as much as we can to meet the needs of our stakeholders and kind of meet them where they are, there is something that always needs to be included, and that's the analytic assessment. So this is just kind of a checklist and a reminder that no matter how you're communicating, you have to make sure that you have your experts and you're pulling from expert sort of resources. You've got sources that have been vetted and that are high confidence. You're using those structured analytic techniques. You're providing judgments, but any judgment you provide, you're being transparent with what evidence it's based on, and again, checking your sources for that reliability and credibility. But again, if you don't have this assessment in there, if you're not doing analysis, if you're not saying, this is why it matters for you, this is what we recommend based on what we know about you and your decisions and the uncertainty you're trying to battle, then you're not really giving them intelligence. You're just giving them information, probably overloading them with information, and then putting the onus of analysis on them. And that's not good, because they're not going to do it, and they don't know the structured analytic techniques because they're not analysts, right? So again, no matter how you're differentiating, just make sure that you've included that sort of analytic assessment, and here's the checklist for it. So here's an example of how we differentiate some of the different communication streams. This is an example, going back to that stand-up call, that real 15-minute quick, hey, what's everybody seeing? This is just the email we shoot out as an example, or as a template that folks can use, again, to communicate internally. And when we think about what are the needs of the folks who are in that steering committee, that stand-up call, we've got the high-level executives, VP and above, et cetera. They usually can't actually attend the stand-up call, right? Or they don't have time to listen in because they're being pinged 6 other times. So how do we make sure that they are getting this information, it's sticking with them, and we're being super fast and super efficient with it? So this is the example of all this different situation updates. It's got the right POCs, it's got the topics, the teams that it comes from, so those executives, our scan readers, can very, very quickly go through this. I said it takes 7 touches to get some information to stick. The other thing to keep in mind about your audiences is they are all scan readers. So in general, they say you have 7 seconds of attention before they're reading through your document before they move on to the next thing. Now everybody's saying that it's more like 3 seconds of attention. So you have to make sure that the information you're getting them is extremely condensed. You're putting that bottom line up front, and it's easy for them to find what it is that they're looking for so that you're using a standard form and that information is in the same place every time. Another example of some of the differentiated information, this is something we put into our Mandiant Advantage platform that goes directly to customers. So our customers, again, have very different use cases. They need to know what's going on quickly. They need to know what relevant intelligence is being produced. Where are the reports? Where can they find them? How to get them quickly? Where is the one-stop shop of the Mandiant view into an issue? So that's basically what you see here. You see there's the ongoing updates, which again, we pull from that daily email we send out internally. It's that self-feeding information ecosystem. We're not creating this stuff from scratch for every single vehicle. It's kind of getting stripped and recycled and updated or tweaked for this different format for these different stakeholders. We have the list of relevant reporting. It's all a single roll-up, and then we get all of our public-facing collateral also in one single place, because again, that's the use case and that's the need for this particular audience. And then the third item that gets differentiated, this is an example of an update slide. Again, did not create this from scratch. We took the information, we condensed it down yet again. Now it's appropriate for a different format, and again, the form is the message. The message is the form, right? So this is that one single slide. Here's everything that you need to know. Situation update, cyber activity update, key quick bullet points that folks can usually very, very easily integrate into their executive briefings.
All right, so the next question that we're going to look at is, what is the right content for a crisis intelligence function to distribute, and how can you go about determining that? And there are a couple quick considerations that we're going to talk about in this category. The first of those is, if you're looking at, what's the content that I need to include in any of those delivery methods to the right audience at the right time in the right format, a good starting point is, have I made a deliberate assessment of what is the use case that I'm trying to serve? Which you can see from this simple example framework doesn't have to be very complicated, but basically what someone has done in this notional example is say, what are we delivering and why? What kinds of content are we producing? What does that look like? And what is somebody trying to do with that information? And in order to get to this point, the hard work behind the scenes would be somebody has identified who are the stakeholders that I'm trying to serve and what do they need to know in order to do their jobs. Another quick metric for are we delivering the right content is, if you're delivering intelligence content that's going to be used for somebody for further messaging or action, does it tell my audience what they need to say in their next interaction? Or does it tell them what action they need to take in their next action? And as a simple example, there's often a tendency when you're dealing with these situations to give kind of a full dump of everything that you know to the audience and say, here's basically everything that we've got. And a way that might not be helpful is, let's say you're working with an audience whose job is primarily to talk publicly about threats that the organization is dealing with. If you give them a lot of TLP-read information, as Shanyn mentioned earlier, that might end up being more confusing than helpful. So a lot of this is kind of the other side of, how can I limit what I provide to the content that's actually helpful and contributing to the next action in the next situation instead of getting in the way. And the final piece that we'll touch on here actually ties directly into the next section, so we'll jump into that. Not only do we need to have a deliberate assessment of audience and use case, and what we provide be scoped down to what is relevant to that, but also what we provide needs to enable the right decisions. So how do we determine what are the right decisions to enable across the organization? This is definitely an area that needs to be very closely tailored to an individual organization. There's not one formula for success. As a simple example, let's say you have a 10-person hunting team in one organization and none in another organization, or it's one person's, one of multiple hats. That's going to cause the decisions that need to be made to look very different, and have follow-on implications for what kind of intelligence do I need to deliver. But what we will do is talk about a couple examples of frameworks that you can use to think through for your specific organization or organizations that you work with. How can I figure out what are the decisions that I need to enable, and how can I ensure I'm providing the right content to support those? So the first framework that we can use to think through that is who needs to prepare for threat activity within my organization and proactively defend versus who needs to identify threat activity when it is happening versus who needs to stop threat activity that's actually taking place against the organization. And as a simple example, if you're thinking about an intrusion actor that the organization considers to be important, you could really pick any, let's say as an example, APT29. It might be helpful for certain groups in the organization to proactively know, hey, this is what APT29 activity tends to look like. Do we have the right controls in place to prevent that? Might be appropriate for other groups to know, hey, here are indicators for what APT29 activity looks like right now, so you can match that up with alerts. And of course, this may or may not be in the format of like an email or a briefing. This may be in other forms of intelligence support, such as an ongoing integration with those teams. And it might in turn be helpful for other organizations when they say, hey, or excuse me, other parts of your organization, when they say, hey, we're dealing with an incident that we think might be APT29, to have the latest playbook of this is what this group's activity looks like. So thinking through, who needs what in my organization in terms of who needs to prepare, who needs to identify threat activity, who needs to stop threat activity, can help build out that list of what are the actions and what are the decisions that I'm trying to support. Another way to look at it would be who needs to be able to effectively prioritize the security jobs that they're doing, who is dealing with so much that they can't possibly get to it all and need to be able to effectively prioritize what they're doing versus who needs a starting point and doesn't have all the information that they would need to take action against threats without being illuminated on, what does the threat landscape look like? And as an example, actually both in the context of vulnerability management. The vulnerability management function needs to know what vulnerabilities there are and the key characteristics of those, but that's very quickly going to become so overwhelming that they can't do anything with it. So they also need to know, how do I prioritize these? They also need to know, which are going to be most relevant to my organization based on the metrics that are appropriate to my organization. And, as you go through that process, the output that you come up with might look something like this. Might look like some way to say, okay, these are the groups that we're trying to serve, these are the actions that they're trying to take, and this is an example of content that we can provide that's going to help them take those actions. And you can see there's some functions that we might talk about in the industry that aren't represented here, like for example, maybe fraud response, or there are some functions here that might not be as relevant to your organization, for example, marketing, depending on who you're trying to serve with the intelligence that you deliver internally. So going through those exercises of asking the questions of, how do I determine what different stakeholders need is what's going to be essential for building out a framework like this. We're going to recap kind of what we've discussed so far and look at it from a slightly different angle by focusing on what are some key takeaways that we've seen for successes and shortcomings. What, as we look at this overall, are a few top ways that we've seen organizations have challenges in their response from an intelligence perspective to crisis situations, and what are a few ways that we've seen it really get done right. The first way that we've seen shortcomings in this area is when the crisis intelligence function, whoever's responsible for that, whether it's a specific team's job or somebody's additional hat or whatever else that looks like, we've seen a shortcoming of waiting to say something until you have all the answers. And this can look like, I really want my deliverable to be perfect, I really want it to be polished, I'm not going to say anything until I have answers to these and these and these questions, when really the audience just wants to know, what do you know right now? And if that includes a lot of, I don't know this right now, that's okay. The audience wants to know, what do you know right now that can help me do my job? Another shortcoming that we've seen is emphasizing detail over utility, kind of going back to what we were saying about, certain audiences may find that certain information gets in the way rather than is useful. You want to think about what audiences need this information versus that information, and direct what you're doing accordingly. Another big problem that we have seen is making the audience come to you. So I really like the way that Shannon put it. You kind of have to assume to some extent that if you build it, they won't come, and you need to go meet the audience where they are. And so it's not always effective, for example, to say, yeah, we really did a great job responding to this situation, and all our intelligence for our internal stakeholders is over in this system for people to go find if they can remember where to go to get it. That's not really what we want to do. We more want to say, what are the right ways to engage with our stakeholders where they are, and how can we deliver into that? Saying it once. Whether the answer is you need to have 7 touch points or whatever it is, in a crisis situation, everybody's going to be distracted. If there's something worth saying once, one way, it's probably worth saying 10 times 5 ways to make sure that the audience gets it. And finally, assuming that delivery is consumption. Just because the audience has received some information doesn't mean that they've been able to effectively use it to do what they need to do. So it's important to think about success in terms of, has my audience been able to take the actions that they need to take?
So if we think about what success actually looks like, and a lot of folks ask us for what are KPIs, what are some key performance indicators that I can use to measure quantitatively or qualitatively what success is? It is not the number of intelligence products that have been produced. That is far and away the most important. What is worse, 10 bad intelligence or 10 intelligence reports that cannot be used, either because the analysis is bad or because it's not the right information, or 50 intelligence reports that cannot be used, right? 50 is worse because you're spending a lot more time, wasting a lot more time, and you're not reaching that end goal of intelligence turning into some sort of action, right? So that is not the KPI that we want to be using, even though a lot of intelligence programs who are still kind of lower in their maturity are doing this. What you do want to look at instead is the number of intelligence questions that are being answered. And that's not necessarily inbound questions that your stakeholders are giving you. Think back to those use cases. Think back to that stakeholder analysis. What are the decisions that they're trying to make? What are the actions that they're trying to take, right? And how does intelligence help them get there? Well, if you're able to map that out at the beginning as part of your stakeholder analysis, it's real easy to come back in the end and say, were we able to accomplish this, 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 and this, right? So that's kind of your checklist, how you can measure success, even when you're not getting feedback directly from your stakeholders, because you're probably not getting feedback directly from your stakeholders. They usually don't like to give feedback, but you still need to figure out how many questions you've answered, right? The other thing to look at is the number or the nature of actions that have been taken. So this is taking that intelligence questions and pushing it one step further. Not only did you give them the right intelligence at the right time, but were they able to use it? And if that action that you were expecting to have happen didn't happen, why or why not? That's an opportunity for you to drill down and say, where is the process breakdown and what can we do about it, or who do we need to notify? Because if the intelligence, again, is not leading to action, then your crisis response function is not successful. Other ways to look at successful programs have reliability and stakeholder confidence, meaning your stakeholders trust you, right? We found out a couple of times that we've had folks who are customer facing, there's a big crisis that happens. Before, all of those different individuals would go and immediately start researching on their own. They would immediately start building their PowerPoint decks. They would be spending a lot of cycles doing these things on their own, right? Now, they don't do anything. They say, this function has got it. I'm going to reach out to them and see what they're going to say. And again, that's much better because it's more efficient and it makes sure everybody's going to have the same official analytic line. And it means that they're confident in the information we're giving them and we're reliable. They know that they can come to us when they need us, right? And that is the best part of a crisis function, is that you've set this expectation with your stakeholders, with your audiences, but it's kind of a social contract because that means you have to fulfill it, which means you have to resource it. It means you need to be able to build out these processes and you can't miss them because that will shatter the trust that your stakeholders have in you and they'll go back to doing things on their own, right? And the other thing is that those successful programs have that self-sustaining ecosystem where you don't have to recreate the wheel for every single message, for every single audience, for every single communications vehicle. You're able to take things once, put it into that centralized clearinghouse, and then parse it out and adapt it for different messages. And so that's how you get to that final successful program that has the right intelligence, the right people, the right time, in the right format, with the right level of content, and that helps them make the right decisions. And thank you.
And we'd be happy to take any questions. Thank you.
I have a
You want to take a shot at that first?
Yeah, so for us, the most useful thing has been those round-robin stand-up calls because you have the different team leads directly there. So you can kind of refresh what information have they been given in the last couple of days, but you can ask them immediately right there what actions have been taken. And I think that really only works because this function has a steering committee that has members at the VP and above level, the leadership level, who are bought in and who own the function and all of the actions that it needs to take, which means that they're able to and willing to and have that social contract almost that they will go to their teams and say, we do need to take this action. We need to make sure that this happens, right? So again, that stand-up call is really key for that.
Another thing I'd say is a kind of a good metric of is the right coordination happening, is it not, is does it start to look like there's multiple unconnected responses again? Because if people aren't getting what they need from what we're delivering, then they're going to kind of drift back into, we're just going to go take care of this on our own separately. And so keeping an eye on that, however is appropriate, is kind of key to figuring out, are we delivering the right value?
I think we're at time. We can stick around for questions if folks want to come up directly, if that works. Okay.
Thank you again.
Thank you.